In 1971, President Nixon did something that changed your life forever, and you probably have no idea it happened. On a Sunday night in August, he walked into the Oval Office and, with a single announcement, severed the last link between the US dollar and gold. Overnight, money became, just paper. And once governments realized they could create money out of thin air without physical constraints, everything changed. Today, the average currency loses about 95% of its purchasing power every century. But here's what most people don't realize. It's not an accident. It's a system. And understanding how this system works is the difference between protecting your wealth and watching it quietly disappear. Let's dive in. Think about this for a second. Your great-grandparents could buy a dozen eggs for a dime. Today, that same dozen costs $4. Same eggs, massively different price. Most people chalk this up to inflation and move on. But inflation isn't some natural force like gravity. It's the direct result of deliberate decisions made by central banks and governments. And those decisions follow patterns that have repeated throughout history with stunning consistency. Here's what we're going to uncover today. First, we'll look at exactly how modern monetary systems allow governments to manipulate currency value in ways that would have been impossible just 50 years ago. Then, we'll explore 3 specific mechanisms they use, and I'm talking about real, documented strategies that are happening right now. Finally, we'll connect the dots to show you what this means for your purchasing power and how to think about protecting yourself. By the end of this, you'll never look at money the same way again. Quick note, this video is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. Always do your own research and consult with qualified professionals. Let's start with a story that perfectly illustrates how this works. In 2008, during the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve faced a problem. Banks were collapsing, credit was frozen, and the economy was in free fall. Their solution? They created $3.7 trillion with a T out of thin air through something called quantitative easing. They didn't print physical bills. They literally typed numbers into a computer, and suddenly that money existed. The Fed's balance sheet went from about $800 billion in 2007 to over $4.5 trillion by 2015. Then during COVID-19, they did it again, adding another $4 trillion in just 2 years. Now, you might be thinking, wait, if they can just create money whenever there's a crisis, why don't we do that all the time? Great question. And here's where the manipulation begins. The first mechanism governments use is what economists call monetary expansion. But let's call it what it really is. Dilution. Imagine you and 9 friends start a pizza company. You each own 10% of the company represented by 10 shares. Now imagine one person, let's call them the Federal Reserve of Pizza, suddenly creates 90 more shares and keeps them all. You still have your 1 share, but now instead of owning 10% of the company, you own just 1%. Your share didn't disappear, but its value got diluted. That's exactly what happens when governments expand the money supply. According to the Federal Reserve's own data, the M2 money supply, that's basically all the money in circulation plus savings accounts, has increased by over 400% since 1980. But here's the kicker. GDP, which represents actual economic output, has only grown about 300% in the same period. That gap, that's your purchasing power being transferred away from you. But wait, there's something even more important to understand about how this manipulation works. Governments don't just create money randomly. They do it strategically, and they use 3 primary mechanisms that work together like a well-oiled machine. Mechanism 1 is direct monetary creation through central banks. We already touched on this with quantitative easing, but it goes deeper. Central banks buy government bonds, essentially government IOUs, with money they create from nothing. The government gets cash to spend immediately. The central bank gets an asset on its books, and the currency supply expands. It's genius if you're the government, and devastating if you're trying to save money. The Bank of International Settlements reported that central banks globally purchased over $9 trillion in government bonds between 2008 and 2022. That's $9 trillion of dilution. Here's the crazy part. This mechanism was actually illegal in most developed countries until the 1970s and 80s. There were laws preventing central banks from directly financing government spending because policymakers understood it led to currency debasement. But those restrictions were gradually removed, and now it's standard practice. The very safeguard designed to protect currency value was dismantled, and most people never even heard about it. Mechanism 2 is more subtle: interest rate manipulation. Central banks set the base interest rates that influence everything from your mortgage to your savings account. When they lower rates to near zero, or even negative, as we've seen in Japan and Europe, they're essentially punishing savers and rewarding borrowers. According to a 2023 study by the OECD, American savers lost approximately $2.4 trillion in potential interest earnings between 2008 and 2021 due to artificially suppressed interest rates. Think about what that means. Your savings account used to earn 4 or 5% interest in the 1990s. Today, you're lucky to get 0.5% at most traditional banks, while official inflation runs at 3 to 4%. That's a guaranteed loss of purchasing power. You're being financially penalized for the responsible behavior of saving. Meanwhile, governments and large corporations borrow at these artificially low rates, essentially transferring wealth from savers to debtors. And the biggest debtor of all? The government itself. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. There is a third mechanism that most people never connect to currency manipulation: the timing of money creation and who gets it first. Economists call this the Cantillon Effect, named after an 18th century economist who first described it. Here's how it works. When new money enters the system, it doesn't reach everyone simultaneously. The government spends it first, then banks and financial institutions get it, then large corporations, and finally, months or years later, it trickles down to regular workers through wages. But here's the problem. Prices start rising as soon as that new money hits the economy. So the people closest to the money creation, governments, banks, asset holders, get to spend it at yesterday's prices. By the time it reaches your paycheck, prices have already adjusted upward. Let me give you a concrete example. When the Fed created trillions during COVID, where did it go first? Financial markets. The S&P 500 went up 114% from March 2020 to December 2021. Real estate prices surged 40% nationally. If you owned stocks and property, your wealth expanded dramatically. If you were a worker waiting for wages to catch up, you watched everything get more expensive while your purchasing power actually declined. The Federal Reserve's own research from 2022 showed that the bottom 50% of Americans by wealth saw their real purchasing power decrease by 8% during this period, while the top 10% saw wealth increases of over 30%. This isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. It's a wealth transfer mechanism disguised as economic stimulus. You might be thinking, but don't we need this money creation to prevent economic collapse? And look, there's legitimacy to that argument. The 2008 financial crisis could have turned into a second Great Depression without intervention. The question is not whether monetary policy can ever be useful, it's whether the current system is being used responsibly or whether it's been weaponized into a tool for transferring wealth from savers to debtors, from the middle class to asset holders, from future generations to the present. Let's look at what history tells us about this pattern. And we've seen this movie before, and the ending is never pretty. In Weimar Germany during the early 1920s, the government faced massive war debts. Their solution was to print money to pay those debts. By November 1923, a single US dollar was worth 4.2 trillion marks. People brought wheelbarrows of cash to buy groceries. Life savings became worthless. The middle class was wiped out. Now, I can already hear the objection. That was hyperinflation. We're nowhere near that. You're right. We're not experiencing Weimar-level collapse, but we are experiencing the same fundamental process, just at a slower pace. The Bank of International Settlements published research in 2024 showing that no major fiat currency, that's currency not backed by physical commodities, has maintained its purchasing power for more than 100 years. The British pound has lost 99.5% of its value since 1900. The US dollar has lost about 97% of its purchasing power since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. The mechanism is identical to Weimar Germany, only the speed is different. And that slower speed is actually more insidious because it's hard to notice. If your currency loses 50% of its value overnight, you riot. If it loses 50% of its value over 20 years, you barely notice. You just accept that things cost more now than they used to. Here's another historical pattern worth noting. Rome didn't fall in a day, and Roman currency didn't collapse in a day either. It took centuries of gradual debasement. Roman emperors started reducing the silver content in their coins, from 95% pure silver down to just 5% by the 3rd century AD. They were literally diluting the currency by mixing in cheaper metals. Sound familiar? Today, we don't need to physically mix in cheaper metals. We just create digital entries. But the effect is identical. Each unit of currency represents less real value. The Roman historian Dio Cassius wrote about how merchants refused to accept Roman coins because they had been debased so many times. People lost faith in the currency, trade broke down, and the economy collapsed. The pattern is always the same. Governments overspend, they can't raise enough taxes, so they debase the currency. It creates temporary relief, but long-term catastrophe. So what does all this mean for you right now in 2026? First, understand that currency manipulation is not a conspiracy theory. It's official policy. Central banks openly publish their plans for monetary expansion. The manipulation isn't hidden. It's just explained in technical language that makes people's eyes glaze over. When you hear terms like quantitative easing, asset purchases, or accommodative monetary policy, translate that to creating new money that dilutes existing money. Second, recognize that your purchasing power is being silently taxed through inflation. The government does not need to explicitly raise your taxes when they can simply create new money and inflate away the value of your savings. According to Federal Reserve data, if you kept $100,000 in cash since 2000, it would have the purchasing power of about $60,000 today. You didn't spend a penny, but you lost $40,000 in real terms. That's a 40% invisible tax. Third, and this is crucial, understand the difference between nominal wealth and real wealth. Your salary might have increased 30% over the last decade, but if the cost of housing, food, and energy increased 50%, you're actually worse off. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that real median household income, that is income adjusted for inflation, is roughly the same today as it was in 1999. 27 years of working, and the average American household has made zero progress in real terms. So here's how to think about this. In a system where currency is constantly being devalued, holding only cash is a guaranteed way to lose purchasing power. That doesn't mean you should take reckless risks, but it does mean you need to think strategically about what you own. Historically, assets that can't be arbitrarily created, real estate, commodities, productive businesses, precious metals, tend to maintain or increase their value in real terms over time. Look at gold as an example. In 1971, when Nixon ended gold convertibility, gold was $35 an ounce. Today, it's around $2,750 an ounce. That's a 71% increase. Meanwhile, the dollar has lost 87% of its purchasing power since 1971. Gold didn't become more valuable. The dollar became less valuable, and gold simply maintained its purchasing power. The World Gold Council, its research shows that gold has preserved wealth across every major currency collapse in recorded history. But here's where it gets nuanced. No one can predict exactly when or if the current system will face a major crisis. What we can say with confidence is that the patterns we're seeing now, unsustainable government debt, continuous monetary expansion, negative real interest rates, these patterns have historically led to currency crises. The IMF reported in 2024 that global government debt reached $315 trillion, or 360% of global GDP. That's the highest peacetime debt level in human history. The question isn't whether this is sustainable. It's clearly not. The question is how long it can continue before something breaks. And that's where individual empowerment comes in. You can't control monetary policy, but you can control how you position yourself within the system. Here's the framework I want you to remember. Money is a tool for storing and exchanging value, but in a system of currency manipulation, its effectiveness as a store of value is compromised. That means you need to think beyond just accumulating currency units and start thinking about accumulating real assets that hold value regardless of what happens to paper money. The governments and institutions that benefit from this system aren't going to change it voluntarily. Why would they? It allows unlimited spending without immediate consequences. The consequences come later, and they fall on savers, retirees, and anyone on a fixed income. Understanding the system is the first step toward protecting yourself from it. If this changed how you think about money and currency manipulation, you need to watch my video on the hidden patterns that precede currency collapses. I break down the specific warning signs throughout history that signal when a currency is approaching a crisis point, and some of those signs are flashing red right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. We're uncovering the truth about global currencies every week, and this is just the beginning. See you in the next one.